Ever heard of a mosque leader asking a man to move
Yeah.
because he was just too handsome?
It's a fascinating story, isn't it?
It is, and it's just one of the many surprising details we're uncovering today in our deep dive into same-sex desire in early modern Europe,
It's a topic that can really challenge a lot of our assumptions about the past.
especially when we try to view history through a modern lens.
Right.
Luckily, we have an expert guide for this journey, Professor Sol Malcolm. His book, Forbidden Desire in Early Modern Europe, takes us back to a time from about 1400 to 1750, when the very concept of identity, especially sexual identity, was very different.
Very different from our modern understanding.
Exactly.
One of the things that might seem jarring to modern readers is Professor Malcolm's use of terms like sodomy and sodomite.
Yeah, I can see how those words would raise some eyebrows today.
Yeah.
They definitely carry a lot of baggage.
They do, but Professor Malcolm uses them deliberately.
Why is that?
Well, because he argues that trying to impose the 21st century concept of homosexuality onto that era just doesn't work.
It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Exactly. The way people understood and experienced same-sex desire back then was rooted in their own cultural norms and values.
Hmm.
So to really understand their experiences, we need to use the language and concepts of their time.
Okay, that makes sense. So where do we even begin to unpack all of this? Professor Malcolm takes us to a surprising starting point. The Ottoman Empire.
Right. What he reveals is a social landscape where desire for teenage boys was not only accepted, it was actually considered part of the natural order of things.
Wow, okay. Before we jump to any conclusions here, I think it's important to remember the context.
Absolutely.
We're talking about a predominantly male social sphere. Coffee houses, bathhouses, even mosques.
Exactly.
And that's where that anecdote about the mosque leader comes in. Professor Malcolm describes a situation where a mosque leader asked a beautiful young man to move because he was too distracting to the men during prayer.
Yeah, it's a striking image, and it really highlights the cultural norms of the time.
It might sound shocking to us today, but it seems like this kind of attraction towards younger men wasn't considered unusual at all.
Right, and we even have legal documentation to back this up.
Like what?
Fatwas.
Fatwas.
Issued by religious authorities that confirm that this attraction was considered normal.
So, hold on, you're talking about official Islamic rulings.
Yes, fatwas. They were essentially legal opinions issued by Islamic scholars on various matters, including social behavior.
Makes it.
And these fatwas actually reflect a really fascinating tension.
What's that?
Well, on the one hand, desiring a young man was seen as natural. But on the other hand, the act itself, the act of sodomy, was considered sinful.
So it's like this unspoken rule. You could admire a beautiful young man, but acting on that desire, well, that crossed the line.
Exactly. Desire was acceptable, but action was not.
Okay, interesting.
And it's crucial to note that this attraction was directed toward boys, not men.
Right.
Once those boys matured, grew facial hair, they were no longer the object of this specific type of desire.
That's so different from our modern understanding of homosexuality, where attraction is often linked to masculinity itself, regardless of age.
Precisely. It's not about attraction to men, it's about attraction to youth. A very specific kind of beauty that was seen as temporary.
Wow. This really makes you think about how deeply cultural norms can shape what a society considers normal or taboo.
Absolutely.
So far, we've been talking about the Ottoman Empire. But what about the rest of Europe? Was it the same story everywhere?
Well, that's where Professor Malcolm's research gets even more interesting. He actually challenges the idea of a pan-European pattern of same-sex behavior. Instead, he points to the Western Mediterranean, particularly cities like Florence, as a region with striking parallels to the Ottoman Empire.
So you mean this same age-differentiated attraction toward younger men?
Exactly. We have records from Florence showing that thousands of men and boys were brought before special tribunals.
Tribunals.
Basically, courts specifically tasked with handling moral offenses.
Okay, kind of like a morality police of the time.
In a sense, yes.
I see.
And the records from these tribunals show a pattern of age-differentiated relationships that really mirrors what we see in the Ottoman Empire.
So we have these relationships happening despite the fact that the church condemns sodomy as a grave sin.
Right.
It seems like there's a real disconnect between official doctrine and what was actually happening in society. Did people just turn a blind eye?
Well, Professor Malcolm suggests it's a bit more complex than that. He thinks there was probably a spectrum of acceptance and disapproval, kind of like adultery.
How so?
Well, adultery was technically a sin, but it was also fairly common and even tolerated within certain social circles.
So it's not as simple as saying everyone either fully embraced or condemned these relationships.
Exactly. There were consequences for those who got caught, but the fact that these practices persisted despite the risks tells us that official condemnation didn't always reflect the reality of people's lives.
That makes sense. So we've talked about the Ottoman Empire and the Western Mediterranean,
Right.
and they both had these shared cultural norms around same-sex desire.
Mm.
But you mentioned earlier that Northern Europe was different.
It was. How so?
Well, Professor Malcolm argues that Northern Europe had a distinct culture around same-sex relations, and he finds less evidence of widespread practice and a different dynamic than the age-differentiated patterns we see in the Mediterranean.
Okay, so less of a focus on teenage boys.
It seems that way, but honestly, there's just less evidence to go on.
Hmm.
Professor Malcolm cautions against assuming that this lack of evidence means it wasn't happening at all.
Right.
He suggests there might be other factors at play.
Like maybe these relationships were more hidden, less openly acknowledged.
Exactly. It's possible that the social structures and cultural norms of Northern Europe led to different expressions of same-sex desire, expressions that left less of a trace in the historical record.
It's like a puzzle with some missing pieces,
It is.
which I guess is part of what makes this period so fascinating to study.
Absolutely.
I'm already starting to rethink everything I thought I knew about this part of history.
That's great to hear. We're only scratching the surface here, though, and I'm definitely eager to hear more.
Well, there's a lot more to uncover. Professor Malcolm's book also delves into a major turning point that happened in the 18th century, a period that many historians view as the emergence of homosexuality, at least as we understand it today.
Oh, wow. That sounds like a whole other layer of complexity to unpack.
It is.
We'll definitely have to pick up this thread in part 2 of our deep dive.
I look forward to it.
So we left off talking about this turning point in the 1700s with all this new evidence about same-sex relationships popping up, especially in big cities like London and Paris. What was going on then that kind of led to this change?
Well, a lot of historians have pointed to this period as like the birth of homosexuality as a modern concept. They see this increase in documentation as proof that something new was emerging, like a real shift in human behavior.
And it makes sense, right? I mean, those were times of massive social and cultural upheaval. Cities were exploding, new ideas were spreading everywhere, and traditional norms were definitely being challenged left and right. It seems pretty natural that ideas about sexuality would be part of that shift.
That's a common interpretation.
Yeah.
But Professor Malcolm, he urges us to be a little cautious here.
Okay.
He argues that this wasn't so much a sudden birth of homosexuality as a change in how it was perceived and, more importantly, how it was documented. He suggests that changes in policing and a wave of moral panics across Europe, that they actually created the very evidence that historians then used to support this narrative of a sudden shift.
So you're saying the evidence itself might be skewed because of the way it was gathered, almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly. Imagine a society where same-sex relationships were largely hidden, happening in private spaces, away from the eyes of authorities. Then, all of a sudden, there's a crackdown, an intense focus on rooting out immorality, and these relationships are thrust into the spotlight.
It's like suddenly shining a light into a dark room. You're going to see things you didn't see before, not because they weren't there, but because they were hidden.
That's a great analogy. And what Professor Malcolm is suggesting is that this new visibility, this sudden abundance of court records and police reports, led historians to misinterpret the situation. They saw this surge in documentation as proof of something new emerging. But it might have just reflected a shift in social attitudes and policing practices.
Okay, so if we can't necessarily point to the 1700s as this clear-cut turning point, how do we make sense of this period? Was it all just continuity from, the earlier centuries we talked about?
Professor Malcolm makes a very compelling case for continuity, especially in Northern Europe. He argues that when we really examine the evidence from both before and after 1700, we actually see similar patterns of behavior, similar expressions of same-sex desire.
Just maybe not as openly documented.
Exactly.
So the idea that homosexuality suddenly appeared out of nowhere in the 18th century is just too simplistic.
Yeah, it's probably too neat and tidy, right?
Right.
Professor Malcolm cautions us against imposing our modern understanding of identity onto the past. He encourages us to try to approach these historical figures on their own terms, to recognize that their experiences and self-perceptions might have been very different from our own.
This is really shifting my perspective. It's like we're learning a new language for talking about sexuality and history,
It is, isn't it?
moving beyond just labels and categories, to really try to understand the complexities of human experience within specific cultural contexts.
Absolutely.
It's fascinating.
And that's kind of the beauty of history, isn't it? It challenges us to step outside of our own assumptions and confront the messy, nuanced reality of the past.
Yeah.
And in doing so, it can offer profound insights into ourselves and the world we live in today.
So true. It really makes you wonder. If identity is fluid and shaped by cultural norms, what does that say about our own understanding of homosexuality today? Are our modern categories potentially limiting us in some ways?
That's a question that Professor Malcolm leaves us to ponder.
Yeah.
His work really challenges us to rethink not only the past, but also the present, to question the very categories that we use to understand ourselves and each other,
Right.
and to be careful about simplifying complex human experiences.
There's so much to unpack here. I feel like we've only just begun to scratch the surface.
Oh, we have.
What stood out to you the most from Professor Malcolm's research?
Yeah.
Was there a specific anecdote or insight that particularly resonated with you?
Well, one of the things that really struck me was Professor Malcolm's discussion of the Mediterranean life cycle.
The Mediterranean life cycle.
Yeah, so imagine a society where young men, really teenage boys, were almost expected to engage in these same-sex relationships with older men.
It's hard to even imagine that today.
Right, and then as these young men matured, they would transition into the role of the active partner, seeking out younger boys themselves.
Wow.
It's a totally different social script than what we're used to.
Yeah. It really underscores how fluid the whole concept of sexuality was in certain times and places. It's amazing to think that this pattern was so prevalent in the Mediterranean world, while Northern Europe, as we discussed, had a completely different dynamic.
It is, and Professor Malcolm's work really highlights the vast diversity of human experience, even within a relatively small geographic area. And throughout his book, he really cautions against, trying to force everyone into these neat, predefined categories.
Right.
Or imposing our modern values onto the past.
Right.
He urges us to really recognize the nuances, the ambiguities, the contradictions that make history so captivating.
It's a good reminder that the past isn't this monolith.
It's not.
It's this tapestry woven from individual experiences,
Yeah.
shaped by so many different social, cultural, and even personal factors.
Absolutely.
It's so much richer and more complex than any single narrative could ever truly capture.
I agree. And recognizing that complexity is so essential, especially as we're grappling with the challenges of our own present, right? I mean, if history teaches us anything, it's that human sexuality is not static. It's fluid, dynamic, and it's constantly evolving.
It's a really powerful message, especially in our world today, where these discussions about sexuality and gender identity can often feel so polarized and divisive.
Yeah.
Professor Malcolm's work reminds us to approach these conversations with empathy,
Yes.
with nuance, and with a willingness to challenge our own assumptions.
Absolutely. He emphasizes that the categories we use to define ourselves and others, they're not fixed. They're not absolute. They're products of our particular time and place, and they're always subject to change.
So where does that leave us then? I mean, I think it means we should be wary of imposing our modern values and categories onto the past.
Yeah.
And maybe, just maybe,
Yeah.
we need to be more open to questioning those very categories in the present as well.
That's a good point. Professor Malcolm's work doesn't necessarily offer, easy answers, but it does offer us a really profound challenge. It invites us to rethink our assumptions about sexuality, about identity, and even the very nature of history itself.
This deep dive has definitely been eye-opening for me. I feel like I have a whole new perspective on this period of history now.
I'm glad to hear that. That's really the beauty of truly delving into a subject, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't just offer information, it gives you a whole new lens through which to view the world.
And maybe even the courage to question those categories and assumptions that are shaping our own lives. Well, thanks so much for joining us for this incredible conversation.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep diving deep.